Okay, so regarding this management guidelines on the management of drug-induced immune and or secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, this is going to be much of a revision of what we had done in the previous sessions as well, because it's here also they have stated all the guidelines regarding the definition of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. That is, it is a decompensated acquired hemolysis caused by the host immune system reacting against the own red cell antigens. So much of it, like we had done the division of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia into warm, cold, and the mixed type. The cold is further divided into the cold hemagglutinin disease and the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. A major proportion of the cold is mostly the cold hemagglutinin disease, and only after its exclusion do we rule in the possibility of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. And there was this table that is, in fact, even revised here about on the classification. That is how warm and cold are divided into a primary and secondary, and cold is divided into cold hemagglutinin and paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, and mixed. And all of these four entities, each of them has these primary and secondary types of causes in causes. The primary is mostly just idiopathic, and in the secondary causes, for the worm, we have neoplasia, infections, and immune dysregulation. For the cold, we have all the IgM associated malignancy, mycoplasma, infections with mycoplasma, and infectious mononucleosis, an autoimmune disease, and post allogenic stem cell transplant. And then regarding the mixed type also, we have the primary mixed type, and the secondary is mostly secondary to autoimmune diseases. Now, these guidelines, we had also gone through the not only the laboratory diagnosis, and also the fact that if a positive DAT is that the evidence of a positive DAT actually is needed for and after exclusion of alternative causes of immune hemolytic anemia, we can proceed with the diagnosis of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And this is regarding this chart, where they had actually there was this reference to the evidence of clinical evidence of hemolytic anemia, and then the dat could be like negative, but we had to rule out all these causes which could cause the false negative DAT because of actually there being a low titer or a low affinity antibodies. So we had to rule that out using column agglutination or monospecific reagents, the IgG, IgM, A, and C3, or the workup for Donat-Landsteiner antibodies, especially in children with hemoglobinuria, children less than 18 years of age. And these are the typical findings for hemoglobinuria, children less than 18 years of age, hemoglobinuria, and cold-associated features and atypical serological features, in which the fact that if the in this cold paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, we mostly come across these titer is usually less than 64, and the range is also less than 25. So these atypical serological findings also help to, and then also we go on with the red cell eluate. So red cell eluate, monospecific reagents, column agglutination, and we rule out the Donat-Landsteiner antibodies. And if this red cell eluate is positive, then we can rule these in as DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And where the DAT is positive and clinical assessment shows no alternative cause of hemolysis, then we'll proceed with the warm and cold workup. But it is actually this part of the algorithm which we are going to deal with now. And in this also this the most important that we're going to do is the drug induced immune hemolytic anemias. And we'll be going to detail about other sort of anemias as well, in which infections, malignancies, they are also causes of they are also causes for this these autoimmune hemolytic anemias, in which these malignancies, the infections, and the immune dysregulation part of warm autoantibodies, and then also the treatment of the drug induced. So some general strategies taken in primary. primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia are also applicable here. Hence, if drug-induced immune hemolytic anemia is suspected, relevant medication must be. So the first line treatment in this case would straightforward be that we will go forward. If it is drug-induced, then the management would be to stop the medication. And the patients would receive folic acid, and because of the hemolytic factor, since it causes hemolysis, venous thromboembolism is common, especially we had discussed risk factors for thromboembolism, mostly in inpatients and in those receiving large dose steroids, and patients who were greater than who had hemoglobin less than 85 gram per liter. Those with acute exacerbations and with hemoglobin less than 85, and those in patients who are mostly non-ambulatory. So in those there is risk of venous thromboembolism. Then because of patients receiving steroid, we had to prevent glucosteroid and glucocorticoid induced osteoporosis and gastrointestinal bleeding. So used PPIs and also these osteoporosis inhibition by vitamin D, calcium, and bisphosphonates in those postmenopausal and men more than 50 years of age. So this was the general outline of treatment. And patients in whom anemia is life-threatening should be transfused with red cells matched for ABO, RH, and KEL rather than waiting for. And for those who require transfusion, they had mentioned that ABO, RH, and KEL antibodies are the one who they should be fully matched for this. And before waiting for the full compatibility testing, we can proceed with these with this RBO, ABO, RH, and KEL matched blood transfusions. And these transfusions, they were generally recommended if especially in life-threatening conditions only. So so however influence over the requirement, and also in the case, most of the cases of secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Now we were discussing first the primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but when we come to the secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemias, another consideration that we, apart from the ABO, RH, and KEL matched blood group, would be that if they had a neoplasm and they had been receiving fludarabine, then they would need to give irradiated product following transfusion. So in cases of secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we need to give irradiated blood secondary to if they had been receiving fludarabine as well. So now the secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia broadly encompasses conditions that and these they are associated with the autoimmune hemolytic anemia. They're most of the secondary causes, and the strength and significance of the association varies, and conditions may represent two parts of a complex immune mediated disorder. That is, often the associated condition can be treated on its own as well, but often it will improve when the treatment for the associated when the causative agent is done. So not only you need to treat the autoimmune hemolytic anemia itself also, but sometimes if you treat the causative associated condition also, then also the immune hemolytic anemia can improve. But it's not always so, because they have mentioned that it does not always happen to improve the anemia when the associated condition appears inactive or would not otherwise require treatment. Management of autoimmune hemolytic anemia can usually proceed along similar lines to primary, although cases must be individualized. Now, the distribution of secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia varies according to the population studied, but approximately half are associated with hematological malignancy and a third with infection. So most of the causes of secondary are those associated with malignancies, and in those the hematological malignancies are the most common, rather than the non-hematological malignancies. Although autoimmune hemolytic anemia has been associated with certain non-hematological malignancies as also, in which mostly ovarian cysts and these ovarian carcinomas, they have been associated with the secondary causes of neoplasia, and also some GI tumors also. But mostly these guidelines, they mentioned that approximately half of them are associated with hematological malignancies, and one third of them are associated with infection, and then 1/6 of them with collagen vascular disorders. So based on these, we will most cases are warm, but secondary cold hemagglutinin disease is also reported, as he had mentioned here as well, that this cold hemagglutinin disease also has a secondary component in which these IgM associated causes with malignancies, mycoplasma and infections and autoimmune diseases. This can also cause secondary cold hemagglutinin disease. So malignancies would cause this monoclonal proliferation of IgM, and these infections, the mycoplasma and infectious mononucleosis, would cause the polyclonal um, uh, increase in polyclonal IgM component. And some common or important associations are considered below. Their associated hematological conditions are CLL and NHL and HL. And the benign sort of solid are the ovarian teratoma and thymoma. Okay, so important one that they mentioned for solid tumors is the ovarian teratoma and thymoma, but these they are mentioned as benign lesions, and the malignant neoplasms may also be, of course, associated with other solid tumors. They are also associated with these, and infections, the mycoplasma and infectious mononucleosis, and in some certain cases, even hepatitis C is also associated with the cryoglobulinias and associated immune dysregulation. The immune dysregulation can occur both in autoimmune disease like SLE and Sjogren's syndrome and scleroderma, and also with the common variable immune deficiency. Then also following and also in the cases of ulcerative colitis and following hemopoietic stem cell transplantation. So, and also with solid organ transplantation, in which case we have to rule out the passenger lymphocyte syndromes. Then even Evans in children, Evans syndrome and Giants childhood autoimmune hemolytic anemia associated with giant cell hepatitis. And then of course this component of drug induced immune hemolytic anemia. So the causes mostly are those associated with hematological malignancies, and then also the those associated with the infections in which infectious mononucleosis and mycoplasma and hepatitis C are most common. Then those immune dysregulations in which we have the SLE, Sjogren's, and common variable immunodeficiency diseases and ulcerative colitis. And also following transplant in both the hemopoietic stem cell transplant and solid organ transplantation. Then for childhood diseases, we have mostly the Evans syndrome and autoimmune hemolytic anemia associated with giant cell hepatitis. And of course, then this fifth category of drug induced. So it could be drug induced, childhood associated, and then all these conditions of immune dysregulation, infections, and malignancy. So this is like a broad classification. Half of them are associated with the malignancy, 1/3 with infections, and 1/6 of them with the immune dysregulation. But other these causes are individualized based on whether which drug has been taken and what the age of the patient. And now first, starting with the neoplasms associated hematological malignancies. So they are associated mostly in CLL and NHL, and patients with autoimmune hemolytic anemia are also at an increased risk of subsequently developing NHL and myelomas. So those with not only do these conditions, they may, as we mentioned earlier, that not only the conditions, the malignancies could lead to could be associated with the immune dysregulation, that is these lymphocytic proliferations. These could be associated with autoimmune hemolytic anemias, but also these autoimmune hemolytic anemias could increase the risk of subsequently developing these sort of NHL and myeloma. And so it's like both ways, that even autoimmune hemolytic anemias can cause these diseases, and or these diseases can also be associated with autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Now, a positive DAT without hemolysis is more frequent than autoimmune hemolytic anemia in positive DAT without hemolysis is more frequent than autoimmune hemolytic anemia in CLL and the myelodysplastic syndromes. So in both these conditions of chronic lymphocytic lymphoma and chronic lymphocytic leukemia and myelodysplastic syndromes, in both of these conditions, there would be evidence of positive DAT. So there will be autoimmune hemolytic component there, but this hemolysis may not be more frequent. There could be a positive DAT without hemolysis in these cases. So there is autoimmune anemia in a way. So we can actually say that there is autoimmune anemia in these cases, but the hemolytic component may often be missing in myelodysplastic and in CLL conditions. So secondary to diagnosis of secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia can be complex because the anemia may be multifactorial. And the LDH affected by, and so also as we had, mentioned earlier, that the lab findings of as we had discussed about in detail about reticulocytopenia, reticulocytosis, which is actually associated with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but they had mentioned that in certain cases, like of course in um, those associated with bone marrow failure syndromes in aplastic anemia, and also in those cases with hemophagocytic syndromes as well. So in all those cases, the reticulocyte count did not increase so much. So even though we expect typical findings that there should be an increased um, um, uh, reticulocyte count, but in certain conditions, as I mentioned, that if we individualize the conditions, the DAT may not, the reticulocyte count is not always increased. So in those conditions, and also then they have mentioned that even in conditions with these malignancies, the LDH may be affected by the disease progression or the liver dysfunction. And the reticulocyte response is prevented by marrow infiltration. So the LDH and reticulocyte count response, they may not be typical of that seen in autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And bone marrow biopsy is therefore most often, if there is a malignant part, then also we had mentioned earlier that bone marrow biopsies are done. They are mandatory to rule out lymphoproliferative disease, and particularly in cold hemagglutinin disease also prior to treatment. So they are mandatory in two cases: when you have suspicion and the age is there, and also other features suspicious for lymphoproliferative disease, and also when we are starting when also there is cold hemagglutinin disease, since this also has much of association with malignancies. And since cold hemagglutinin would mostly present in elderly, so, and we need to rule out these lymphoproliferative diseases which may cause secondary CHAD, because otherwise autoimmune hemolytic anemias presenting in elderly need a workup before we just start giving them steroids. And they are also considered in warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia and mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia, especially if they relapse after steroids. So any of those typical warm and mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia patients who relapse after steroid, they also need this workup for um, uh, this bone marrow biopsy to exclude causes of why their autoimmune hemolytic anemia is resistant to steroids. And it is also advisable, mostly when the DAT is also negative, to look for mostly cases with MDS, whether it could be even in children, it could be like congenital causes of MDS with and acquired causes also sideroblastic anemia. So in all those cases where you believe that there is an hemolysis but the DAT is negative, so also there we need to go for bone marrow biopsy. So mostly it is done mandatory in cases with, uh, where we suspect on history and examination that there could be a possible bone marrow infiltration, but it can and also in conditions with cold hemagglutinin disease to rule out any sort of underlying lymphoproliferative disorder. But it is also considered in warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia and autoimmune hemolytic anemia, particularly if there is relapse after steroids. And also for it is advisable in DAT negative cases. So these are the considerations for bone marrow examination. Now, regarding the infectious screen, the cytomegalovirus reactivation and parvovirus B19 infection should be excluded also. So the exclusion of these causes should also be there. CLL and MDS, it is mostly it mostly depends with the it can just mostly bone marrow biopsy is here, therefore, important part of the initial assessment. Although bone marrow examination in the earlier cases, we had mentioned that the investigations was in the secondary investigations. The primary were just those regarding the hemolytic screen, the immunoglobulin screen, the viral screen, and the autoimmune profile. So although those were taken into account, but when you suspect any sort of hematological malignancies, the bone marrow is also included in the primary part of the assessment. And the infectious screen is then also done with cytomegalovirus and parvovirus B19. Of the 78 patients receiving intravenous immunoglobulins, IVIG for warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, 40% responded, and secondary associations did not predict outcome. So, intravenous immunoglobulin may therefore be considered as a rescue option in patients with the hemolytic malignancy and poorly controlled of warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias. So in those with these hematological malignancies who have these warm, most, because they mentioned that most of the antibodies would be mostly warm. So in these also the warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias, they most of the management for warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias that as we had gone into was much about steroids, starting those steroids, and then also with the rituximab, and then in the third line there was the cyclosporin, azathioprine, danazol, mycophenolate, and splenectomy. But if we suspect any sort of a malignancy, then IV immunoglobulins for warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias showed a 40% response rate, and secondary association, that is 28, had lymphoma or CLL. They did not predict outcome. So IVIG may therefore be considered as a rescue option in patients with the hematological malignancy and poorly controlled warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And so IVIG, they had mentioned earlier, it's mostly prescribed for in the warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias, also in the emergency part, in the emergency management, they had mentioned that IV immunoglobulins, that is 0.4 to 0.5 gram per kg per day for 5 days, and is required. And then most of them respond with their hemoglobin maintained at around with the maintained hemoglobin for more than equal to 3 weeks. So in case of emergency management, when there is hematological malignancy, and then as a rescue option, IVIG may be considered. So the dose is 0.4 to 0.5 gram per kg per day for 5 days. And it will help to actually maintain the hemoglobin for more than 3 weeks. And during this time, the treatment therapy for the CLL may be instituted. So for chronic lymphocytic or any other malignancy, this may be started. So in the interim, that is when we come across a patient with a malignancy and associated autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and the anemia is profound, then in those cases, and we need to have it's an emergency management. So for rescue option, we can consider IVIGs, and they had mentioned also the plasma exchange. But in case of neoplasms, of course, we'd be going mostly for the IVIG treatment, and it would maintain the hemoglobin at a stable rate for more than equal to 3 weeks. And during this time, then we can proceed with the individualized management. So, for example, in patients with the CLL, we could go on along with the management for CLL, and this will, of course, be dealt within the guidelines for CLL management. Then also with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, in NHL, it is the overall autoimmune hemolytic anemia occurs in 2 to 3% of NHL patients, and the response rate of 13 to 19% are reported in angioimmunoblastic T cell lymphoma. So it is this angioimmunoblastic T cell lymphoma which is mostly associated with this immune dysregulation. So in the NHLs, this particular subtype is associated with immune dysregulation, and here also autoimmune hemolytic anemia may be there, and complete remission was achieved in 39 to 56 patients with anti-lymphoma therapy, and with only 3 out of 34 with the steroids or immunoglobulin. And for B cell NHL, so this was the T cell lymphomas, then mostly for the B cell NHLs, treatment with rituximab as a single agent or combined with chemotherapy was often a successful approach. So in angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphomas, the anti-lymphoma therapy combined with the steroids or immunoglobulin may be given. But in NHL, only just the single agent rituximab or combined chemotherapy in certain cases was often a successful approach. So it could be either be a single targeted therapy like with rituximab or combined with chemo for B-cell NHL. And for angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphomas, it could be just a specific anti-lymphoma therapy which would deal with the autoimmune part or hemolytic anemia, as which would actually cure the autoimmune hemolytic anemia also. But sometimes they also needed to add the steroids and IVIG along with the subsequent with the anti-lymphoma therapy as well. And also for splenic marginal zone lymphoma, splenectomy there then was also so these are all the associations. Like if we have angioimmunoblastic hemolytic anemia, angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphomas, we could cure it with the anti-lymphoma therapy or steroids and immunoglobulins. With B-cell NHL, we could cure it with single agent rituximab or in some cases with combined chemotherapy. And for splenic marginal zone lymphomas, splenectomy is a very successful approach. And small patient numbers and heterogeneous regimen make the detailed treatment recommendations difficult, and the NHL type and remission status will influence treatment selection. And remission status will influence the NHL in complete remission and low-grade NHL not otherwise requiring treatment favor an initial autoimmune hemolytic anemia rather than lymphoma-directed approach. So if the primary disease is in complete remission, or if it is in low grade non-Hodgkin lymphoma, not otherwise requiring treatment, then the autoimmune hemolytic anemia treatment would be directed to just treating the immune hemolytic anemia, and it would not be then of course require a lymphoma directed approach. So if the NHL is low grade and or was in complete remission, and the only sort of this presenting the feature presenting in the patient is that of hemolytic anemia, and so this autoimmune hemolytic anemia, although it may be secondary, but it could in this case be primary. If it is not, if the disease is in remission or if it is low grade, then this autoimmune hemolytic anemia is treated as primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and not the lymphoma directed therapy is not given for treating this autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So, and also another sort of reference is that special reference to Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia. Here also the rituximab based therapy is recommended for this secondary IgM monoclonal IgM proliferation in secondary cold hemagglutinin disease. And with the addition of fludarabine, rituximab is considered for symptomatic secondary CHAD, and with the addition of fludarabine to be considered for those with adequate performance status and renal function. So mostly those with the Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia receive the rituximab based therapy. And fludarabine is only considered for patients who have adequate renal function and performance status. So the recommendations regarding non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that the treatment physician should consider the lymphoma type. That is, so we have discussed these 4 types. That is the angioimmunoblastic B-cell, T-cell lymphoma, and then the B-cell NHLs, and then this splenic marginal zone lymphoma, and also the Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia. So these 4 are the major types of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and we need to consider the type and the remission status. That is, if they had been in remission or they are low grade, what is the type of the disease and what is the grade of the disease. So these is something, and also then the remission status when deciding whether treatment should be anti-lymphoma or autoimmune hemolytic anemia directed. So now we'll continue with the Hodgkin's lymphoma and the thymoma component when we cover the malignant diseases. And During this, if somehow the connection is lost because of the 40 minutes um, time limit for this webinar, for this sorry, this session in Zoom. So then please reconnect again, and we'll start again from where we had left off. You should use the same link that you used to connect this session. So the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so we have discussed the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now we'll go on to the Hodgkin's lymphoma. The autoimmune hemolytic anemia occurs in 0.2% of patients with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and a systemic. So with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the overall incidence was 2 to 3%. With the Hodgkin's lymphoma, the incidence is about 2.2%. So it is more with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma than with Hodgkin's lymphoma. There it was 2 to 3%, and here it is only 0.2%. And a systemic review identified 34 cases, 29 of which were at an advanced stage, and 8 presented with autoimmune hemolytic anemia 5 months to 21 years prior to the Hodgkin's. So in most of these cases, even in autoimmune hemolytic anemia with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it could occur either before the treatment, that is, it could be one of the first signs of the disease, or it could occur with a low grade type, or it could occur even after the treatment has been completed. So, but mostly these, in cases of Hodgkin's lymphoma, most of the patients that were studied, they presented prior to Hodgkin's lymphoma, or that is okay, so 8 presented prior and 18 presented concurrently. So the greater number of patients, they presented concurrently when they had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and 8 were at the time of relapse. So before and after the lymphoma, there were 8 patients noted in this patients with in this patient series, and most 18% of them had this lymphoma concurrent with this autoimmune hemolytic anemia concurrent with the lymphoma. And of these, the IgA autoimmune hemolytic anemia presented during complete remission of Hodgkin's lymphoma, and even this IgA type was steroid responsive. Although some of the remaining patients responded to steroid or splenectomy, all treated with anti-lymphoma therapy responded well. So in this case, mostly we go along with the anti-lymphoma therapy. The first line for Hodgkin's lymphoma is the anti-lymphoma therapy. So because if we treat the lymphoma, we will treat most of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia component which is associated with the lymphoma. And patients presenting with autoimmune hemolytic anemia during remission of Hodgkin's lymphoma should be assessed carefully for relapse. So most of the patients, they have this concurrent autoimmune hemolytic anemia with the lymphoma. And if it presents after relapse and after treatment, then it is mostly we have to carefully assess for relapse also. So if the patient is in complete confirmed remission, then treatment should be as for primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Now, regarding solid organ neoplasias, the benign, those with ovarian teratoma and thymoma are associated, and for these, the management would also include just the treatment of the underlying tumor, the removal of, for example, in ovarian teratomas. It is a rare association, but is what was not reported in a series of 517 teratomas. But case reports show that patients respond well to steroids or splenectomy, but hemolytic anemia consistently resolves with resection of the tumor. So with ovarian teratomas and with thymomas, the surgery in itself would actually cause the disease to be treated. And when resecting the tumor, concurrent splenectomy is not indicated. So either you should go with the steroids and splenectomy, or if you have done the surgical resection, then splenectomy is not indicated, because mostly it is associated with these ovarian teratomas. And also with the thymomas also, if acute treatment is required, then first line therapy is prednisolone 1 milligram per kg per day, and then go on for surgical resection. So even with thymomas, you just need to treat the in ovarian teratomas, we had this steroid and this steroid or splenectomy, and then treatment, or otherwise we had just in thymomas, we just need to go for prednisolone, or otherwise surgical resection. And with malignant conditions, as in solid organ malignancies, this could vary according with the primary tumor site and histology, and autoimmune hemolytic anemia coinciding with presentation of a malignant tumor is less frequently steroid responsive than idiopathic. So autoimmune hemolytic anemia, a sustained resolution of autoimmune hemolytic anemia has been reported with resection of isolated ovarian renal carcinomas and colonic carcinomas. So there the therapy is basically to treat the underlying malignancy, and a multidisciplinary approach is required. In metastatic autoimmune hemolytic anemia, this can respond to disease control or to corticosteroids. So also, so basically in other malignancies, the solid organ, either they are benign or malignant, I think the most what they're trying to state is that just treating the underlying malignancy and adopting a multidisciplinary approach can treat the autoimmune hemolytic anemia component. So here we'll take a break of about 2 minutes, and then we'll start with the infections. Because I think we've done all the non-Hodgkin's lymphomas and with reference to the 4 main types, and then the Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is about only 0.2% associated with autoimmune. But here also the anti-lymphoma therapy is enough, and presentation after relapse, after treatment would indicate a relapse. So I think we'll just take a break here and then just rejoin.